Riots and Protest of the 1960s by Will Nilson. Civil rights. There were protests over racial segregation and the equality of blacks. These protests originated in the South but eventually made their way further north. They wanted mostly equality, but also better education, housing, employment, voting, and access to public facilities. These were mostly nonviolent protests, and Martin Luther King Jr. was the leader of all these um, segregation riots. So pretty much what happened during this time was uh, these blacks wanted equal rights, and they were getting segregated against. So they pretty much started a riot and protest to get better rights and better equality. The Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was a communist nation was with a communist nation, North Vietnam, against South Vietnam, which later the U.S. helped. This war was very controversial whether the U.S. should join or stay out. This Vietnam War was during the hippie movement, so there's a bunch of these hippies and people like that were kind of saying no war and stuff. Liberals were the minority, so the liberals were part of this, and the liberals were the ones that wanted to stay out of the Vietnam War, but they were the minority. People did not like the way the war was being played out. So all these hippies, they just didn't really want to be in the war to begin with, and they didn't like the killing, and they wanted peace. The U.S. ended up going to the war mainly to stop the spread of communism. So the reason they ended up into the Vietnam War was they wanted to try to stop communism. And the five W's were who. The war was South Vietnam, U.S. and the Allies versus North Vietnam and Viet Cong. What? It was a war for against communism. Where? It was in Vietnam or Southeast Asia. When? It was on November 1st, 1955 to April 30th, 1975. Why? The U.S. fought to stop the spread of communism. Counterculture, also known as the hippie era or movement, started mainly during the Vietnam War, and it started because all these hippies, they wanted to get out of the Vietnam War and stop all this killing. People are trying to argue what is ethically right or wrong. So pretty much they didn't like all the killing and they didn't want to go to war. This was a liberal group and they wanted change throughout the U.S. They were all about peace and trying to get troops out of Vietnam. Their famous saying was "Make love, not war." This was a non-violent group.
The long hair, the stoner speech patterns, the peace symbols, and the flower power. At the time, they were viewed as a very real threat to the American way of life. In addition to opposing the war, hippies advocated communal living at a time when communism was the country's ideological enemy. They spurned the work ethic in an era when people defined themselves by their jobs. They embraced Eastern philosophies and religions that were alien to most Americans. And they took over whole neighborhoods, most famously San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district, where 100,000 hippies settled in for 1967's Summer of Love.
The end.